hello everyone again, still me moderating this. But yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here with Professor Piketty, who, again, like Kantan said, doesn't need an introduction, but I will give it to him anyway. He's a professor at the École Normale des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales at the Paris School of Economics, and he co-directs the World Inequality Lab. And in his books, Capital in the 21st Century, Capital and Ideology, and A Brief History of Equality, and others, he has inspired a generation of scholars and policymakers to think more broadly about redistribution and wealth. And today we will build on his work on this to talk specifically about billionaire taxation and how billionaire taxation relates to these debates. So yeah, my pleasure. And maybe we should just start with a very broad question of like, how do you think billionaire taxations relate to the wider debates of an ideal system of redistribution of wealth?
Well, I mean, my general answer is going to be that we need to go well beyond billionaire taxation, and I will describe some of what I propose, a much sort of broader tax schedule with top tax rate going to 90%, with a full tax schedule from bottom to top. And, we will talk about that, and you will tell me if you are convinced, why you disagree, etc. But before doing that, let me first say that, I think billionaire taxation and the 2% tax on billionaire is it's a very useful and important first step. And so I think, it's important not to stop there and to talk about the next steps, and it's sort of what I do. But at the same time, I strongly disagree with those who say, sometimes you have some people who are very skeptical, who say, it's a bit demagogical, a bit too easy, to just tax the billionaire because, these people are so few, they can't complain. So, but I think Gabriel and Emmanuel, who have pushed this idea of a tax on the ultra wealthy, are fundamentally right that if you don't convince people that you can tax the very, very top, the billionaire, you will never be able to tax the millionaire and the multimillionaire. And I think this is so important, because in the past, there are so many wealth tax, in France in particular, but it's much broader than that, which failed basically because they were unable to convince the public opinion, and they were unable to demonstrate that the billionaire were effectively taxed. And it became sort of very widespread, the view that in practice, wealth tax the millionaire, but not the billionaire. This really contributed to kill the idea of a wealth tax, first because of a sense that it was not fair, and also because in practice, this reduces the tax revenue by a lot if you don't tax effectively the very top. So I think, starting from there and trying to convince, to build confidence and public support in the idea that it is actually possible to target the ultra wealthy, so whether it's over 100 million, 50 million, 200 million, you can talk about it, but really the very, very top, in particular the billionaire, strictly speaking, is a very, very important first step. So I am, entirely supporting, everything Gabriel, Emmanuel have done in this area. This is hugely important. It's not just cosmetic or demagogic or whatever some people will say. I think it's hugely important. That being said, we are not going to solve all the problem we need to solve, and we are not going to build a world that is able to address the challenges of the 21st century in terms of sustainability, in terms of social challenges, only by taxing the billionaire. It's just not enough. There's not enough money over there. There is substantial money, but there's not enough. And so we need to take a broader view at redistribution, at the entire distribution of income and wealth, and beyond taxation. There are a structural reform of the international monetary system, international trade system, which sometimes can bring redistribution of a much greater magnitude than the tax system, strictly speaking, and this can also be better accepted in a way. And all the discussion we have today about trade coming from the US side could also come from the global South side, asking for a different kind of trade regime, and at some point it will. And so we have to put our discussion about global inequality into this broader context. I think that's really important.
Great, thank you. And by the way, small piece I forgot to mention before, but the idea is to keep this conversation very interactive. So we will have an initial starter conversation, but then I will open the floor for questions really early. So yeah, good to know. And in that sense, to which policies do you think it relates the most when it comes to redistribution? So like aside from billionaire taxation, what can billionaire taxation then feed into when it comes to...
Okay, so maybe, well, let me describe to you, just for those of you who don't know this by heart, this was, this comes from Capital and Ideology, and this table is also published in my brief history of equality. So this was published like 5 years ago, but I still, very much support this. I mean, I will say a few words about how my thinking has changed, but if anything, my thinking has changed in the direction of even more redistribution with other tools. I mean, it's difficult to go much beyond 90%, of course, but as I was saying, there are many other tools for redistribution, like structural reform of the international monetary system, trade system, on which I have been working lately, so if anything, I have moved in the direction of even more redistribution, and the tax part is still as important as it was today. I think it's not enough, but it's still as important. So what do you have here? This is a short description of what I would describe, in my view, as a sort of ideal tax system. I mean, it's only a snapshot, but basically you have two big components. You have an income tax and a wealth tax. The income tax, I should say, includes social contribution. So part of the income tax revenue is actually goes to pension fund, health insurance fund, family benefit, whatever you want. It also includes the corporate income tax, which is just, in a way, a component of a comprehensive income tax taxing both individual and corporations. It also includes, in my view, a progressive carbon tax, which should, tax carbon in a progressive manner depending on your total carbon emission. You don't want to tax the same way someone with, 3 tons per year, someone with 20 tons, 100 tons per year of emission. And this has to be, integrated also with the income tax system. So when I say the income tax, it's it's very broad, and then you have the wealth tax, and so the wealth tax. So here this is called the property tax, but this is just the wealth tax. This is a tax on all your property, so everything you own, all your assets. Very comprehensive net wealth concept with no exemption, very much the same as the 2% tax on billionaires that we have been talking about, except that here you have a tax schedule going from 0 to 90%. So how was this tax schedule computed? So for those of you who don't know by heart the appendix of Capital and Ideology, let me just summarize very quickly. These tax schedules were designed to achieve, basically, to achieve a number of objectives. So for income tax schedule, this was basically based on the historical experiment with very progressive taxation, in particular in the United States, where the top tax rate was 80-90% during most of the 20th century. And our evaluation, I mean, my evaluation, but I think with many colleagues, with Emmanuel Saez, we have written papers on this, is that it actually worked quite well. So we have, theoretical optimal tax formula showing that under certain conditions at the top, you want to go to 80-90%. But at the end of the day, I like optimal tax theory a lot, but, I think the main argument to me is an historical argument. It was applied for many decades in very large countries. It worked pretty well, and we can have a discussion about what I mean by working pretty well, but I will try to defend the viewpoint that it worked pretty well. So, why not do it again and at a broader level? For wealth tax, this has never been applied at this kind of tax rate. So what's the rationale for this kind of tax rate? Basically, this tax schedule was computed to return to a kind of wealth concentration that we had around 1980 at the world level and also at the country level, approximately. With very high tax rate at the top, you will return very fast. You could do it, remember Bernie Sanders in 2020 was proposing for a top tax rate of 8% or sometimes 10%, which was already a lot more than the 2% billionaire tax we're talking about. Maybe, the thing is that the top billionaire wealth is rising very fast. 7, 8, 9% per year. If you only have a 2% billionaire tax, it's clear that it's not even going to stabilize the rising consumption at the top. So we all know that this is maybe a useful first step, but this is not even going to stabilize the distribution at a stable level. So you could have 10%, 5-10%. I was advocating in capital in the 21st century 10 years ago is the minimum if you just want to stabilize the distribution. This is what Bernie Sanders and to a lesser extent Elizabeth Warren were proposing in the 2020 campaign. So some people could say, that's enough, 10%, 20%. Why do you need 90%? Because by definition, next year there will be nobody up there. Okay, I'm ready to negotiate, if you really want 10, 20, 30%. I think 90% has the advantage of clarity, which is that if you go very high, if you have one individual who, for some random reason, is going to own 90% of the planet because, he was very lucky, he sort of took control of everything of value in the planet. I think you don't want to wait for 10 years to solve the problem. You should solve it right away. So I think let's be clearer, and for me, that's the advantage of clarity. Now, in this proposal, and let me finish by this, and I'm sure some people disagree in the room about this proposal, and I'd be very, very happy to respond. And by the way, I don't claim I have all the responses. I keep changing my view about this. I was not writing the same thing 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I will keep changing my view, and this kind of discussion will contribute to it. I think I will keep moving in the direction of more redistribution rather than less, but, you can make me change my mind. So I'm, very interested in whatever comes. Let me just conclude by saying that this wealth tax or progressive wealth tax in this proposal raises about 5% of GDP per year, which is a lot of money, of course, and this is supposed to be used to pay for a capital endowment. So this is not used to pay for the budget. So the income tax is raising about 50% of national income, and is supposed to pay for total budget, including social security. The wealth tax here is raising about 5%. Of GDP, and is used. This is exactly what you need each year to pay to everybody age 25 a minimum inheritance for all, which will be in a country like France of about 120,000 euros in capital endowments at age 25. More generally, the amount will be 60% of per adult wealth. So in France, it will be 60% of 200K, so 120K, something like this. Which let me make very clear, in my view, should come on the top of basic income. So this is not to replace basic income, or this is not to replace social security or free education or free health. This is really on the top of everything else, in order to increase the bargaining power of everybody. Because wealth is useful to change power relation in society. It's much more than money. And that's maybe the most important point I want to stress. We talk a lot during this conference about billionaire taxation, but for normal people, wealth is the objective is not to become a billionaire. The objective is to have more control about over your own life. And when you have 120K, so okay, it's not a lot. Maybe from the point of view of someone who is a billionaire, it's like zero. There's no difference between 0 and 100K. But in fact, when you have 100 or 200 or 300 rather than 0, or rather than just debt, because many people have just debt, the big difference is that when you have 100K, 200K, you can, you are yourself in a sort of better bargaining position vis-a-vis the rest of society. So, you don't need to take every job, every wage, every labor condition you are being offered. So, employers don't like that because you're able to negotiate, but, we may like it exactly because employers don't like it. It's that it puts people in a better bargaining power. So it means, you don't need to, you can buy a home if you want, maybe not in Paris, but there are, many places in France or in the world where you can buy a home for that much. You can start a little business. So in the end, whereas if you have 0, you need to pay your rent. If you have a family, if you have children, you have to pay your rent. You have to take whatever job. So this and the minimum income, basic income, is not going to be enough to address that. It's good to have basic income equal to, say, half the minimum wage or 2/3 of minimum wage. Very useful, but that's really very low, very basic. So you need, on the top of that, I think, to have wealth for everyone. And I think it will bring not only a more egalitarian society, but also a much more vibrant and mobile society. And in the long run, so how do I know that? Well, again, my main source of knowledge is historical. So what I observe in the long run is that, there's been a huge decline over the past century of the top 10% wealth share, top 1% wealth share, to the benefit of the what I call in my work the middle 40% or the patrimonial middle class, the people who are not in the top 10, not in the bottom 50. Their share has increased a lot. Basically, 100 years ago, they were as poor as the bottom 50%. Today, they have 20, 30, 40% of total wealth. If you are 40% of the population, you have 40% of total wealth. It means you have about average wealth. So typically, you have 200K in rich country, 100, 200, 300K. You're not immensely rich, but you can own your home, you own a little business, and this makes you more powerful vis-a-vis your own life. And this has been a huge improvement in the long run over the past 100 years. And that's the story I'm trying to tell in my brief history of equality. And you want to continue in this direction, to extend it to the bottom 50%. And just waiting for growth, competition to do the job, doesn't seem to be working very well in the long run. So we need to be a bit more proactive. So that's a quick summary of this table.
Amazing. Thank you so much for making the case for a more ambitious policy on wealth taxation. I think I would open the floor already, if that's okay. I think it's good if we can have a dynamic conversation on this. Is there any questions or comments from the audience there? Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Supriyo, again from the International Monetary Fund. Sort of two questions: impact on work effort, impact on entrepreneurial effort. One. Secondly, more closer to what I do for a living, revenue administration. For a lot of emerging markets and developing economies where the scope of tax evasion is much higher and governance structures are poorer, would having very high tax rates increase people going into the informal sort of economy, in the sense, not in the very developed country European sense, but in a country where you can hide wealth fairly easily, fairly rich people can be in the informal economy. Just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Shall I answer question by question, or you want to take more? Whatever you.
I don't know. We have. Maybe we take a couple of questions
then
and
I
then
need
you
to,
can.
So actually, let me answer this one before I get a pencil. There's a risk I forget. But if you find a pen, So when a country like the US developed very progressive taxation, like in the 30s, it was actually pretty poor. So the productivity of US economy in the 20, if you take PPP euro of today per hour of work, is actually less than India today. So that's interesting, to have in mind, because when I know lots of people, in poor countries today are saying, especially the elite, is saying, oh, we are too poor, to do redistribution. Let's wait that we become as rich as the US, and then we'll do redistribution. I mean, I can see why they say that, of course, but historically, this is not exactly the way it worked. So historically, when countries like the US or Sweden, in the 2030s started big redistribution, they were actually very poor. You take Swedish productivity in 1920. Sweden is a very interesting example, because today we look at Sweden as a sort of very advanced egalitarian country, and sometimes people imagine that it's always been like that. Not at all. Until 1910, 1920, it was a relatively poor peripheral country of Europe, and it was extremely unequal. I tell the story in my work, incredible unequal. Only the top 20% of the people could vote, only the top 20% male voters, but more than that, within the top 20%, you would have between 1 and 100 votes, depending on your wealth. And that's in legislative election. In municipal election, you had no upper limit. And so you had several dozen municipalities where one voter had more than 50% of the voting share. This was Sweden until 1910. And, if you had that in sub-Saharan Africa today, everybody will say, oh, this is complete corruption. These countries are so corrupt, so badly run. Okay, this was Sweden in 1910. This was in the constitution. People were proud of it. This was the law in order to protect property and to make sure that only reasonable people can decide. Now, what happened? What happened is that there was huge, discontent, labor union mobilization, social democratic mobilization. The Social Democratic Party, which at the time was not a conservative party, was a really revolutionary party in its own way, took power in 1932, kept power for more than half a century, and basically took power by election, of course, and basically they put the state capacity of the country to the service of a different political project. So they use the registration capacity, and you're perfectly right to say that state capacity and the capacity to register income and wealth is very important. But this is endogenous. You can build it, and what they did in that case is that actually they took it, so it was already very developed, so that's an interesting lesson, but they used it not to distribute voting rights to wealthier people, but rather to make them pay high tax, to pay for public education, public health system, which, is not perfect. We've seen with COVID the limitation, but was just much better than everything we had seen before. And not only this contributed to make Sweden egalitarian, whereas at the time, in all the data, we have a very beautiful historical study by Swedish economists on Bengström in particular, Waldenström on inequality in 19th century Sweden. It was one of the most unequal countries in Europe. They turned it into very egalitarian, and at the same time, it became a lot more productive and a lot richer. So, I think developing countries today could become a lot more productive with a more inclusive social system, educational system. Now, this is not going to happen in one year, of course. These are long-term evolution. So to give a bit more concrete answer to your concern, I think maybe one mistake that was done in building state capacity in many countries around the world in relation to the tax system is that the registration of property was not given sufficient priority. So many countries try to create, for instance, a value-added tax system, a VAT, or an income tax, without even registering properly the businesses that were out there. And if you don't have basically a cadastre of who everybody owns what, which was the first tax ingredient in the United States, in France, in Sweden, in pretty much every European country in the 19th century, you start with a property tax. Okay, it's not progressive, it's flat property tax, but it is a property tax where you register every piece, not only real estate, but also business assets, small shops, factories, land. It's not so complicated if you do it completely. Then, once you have that, once you know who owns what where, you can start asking businesses to have more complicated company accounts, compute their profits, report their wages, compute their value added. But if you don't have this, and you go directly for value-added tax, income tax, which is what many countries in developing world did in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, you end up with a value-added tax or an income tax which is taxing 3% of taxpayers because the others are unknown to the administration, and you're missing the whole thing. Okay, so it's a quick answer to a very complicated problem, but I think the issue of wealth taxation, wealth registration, property registration is really central. Even if you start with very low tax rate, very flat to begin with, it's very important in order to build public knowledge about economic activity, economic actors, and gradually to move toward a more comprehensive tax system and social system.
Great. I think we have a question there.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Thomas. My name is Fernanda, and I'm a political economist at the New Economics Foundation in London. And I have two quick questions. You mentioned on the growth of the middle class over the years and having a more comfortable, share of the wealth. What we want to do is obviously build the wealth of the bottom 50%. I'm just interested in your views on how the environmental limits, the ecological limits of the planet come into this, and the role, I guess, of taxation of the super rich in actually supporting that. And my second question is, because you mentioned something that I really welcome as a political economist, on the issue of power, and the relationship between wealth, the super rich, and power and control over, society in many ways. What do you think is needed to address those more systemic, I guess, risks that go beyond economics, I guess, on the issue of extreme wealth inequality? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm very happy that you asked this question, because let me say very clearly that ecological challenges, I think, are going to make the reduction of inequality even more necessary and compelling than it will be in any case, that it will be otherwise. But I think there's just no way we can address seriously the ecological challenges of our time and make the preserve planetary habitability in the 21st century with the kind of wealth gap and income gap that you have today. For one simple reason, which is that nobody, in the middle class, let alone the lower income group, either in the north or in the south, is going to accept to make any serious effort to change their lifestyle. If they feel you have some people at the top, who are taking their private jet and do crazy things all the time, and in terms of carbon emission, and at the same time give lessons to the rest of the planet about what should be done. So I think at some point, the reaction toward this, is going to become, this has even become now a literary genre. You have entire novels. If you think of Kim Stanley Robinson, if you've read, sort of planning the reaction against the ultra wealthy in the coming decade or so. But you can put it in a literary manner with this book, The Ministry of the Future, for those who have not read it. But you can also try to look with the language of social sciences and see, and I think it's very complementary, and see that if you think of a crisis like the Yellow Vest crisis in France a few years ago, where basically what the government in France was doing was to say, okay, we're going to increase carbon taxation so that you use your car less intensively and you make more effort at reducing your carbon footprint. Except that at the same time, the same year that the government was raising tax revenue by 10, 15 billion euro on the middle class and the lower income group, he was using the same money to pay for the repeal of the wealth tax and reducing a progressive tax on capital income, etc. And the government was trying to say, no, but this is not the same money. Don't worry, except that these were the same amount. And at some point, if you treat people like fool, they will react very badly. And I think this was like the worst example of what you can think in terms of ecological policy. So of course the carbon tax was removed, and nobody in France now dares to talk about the carbon tax anymore. So thank you, the government who did that. You sort of have destroyed completely any idea of acceptable carbon taxation. Now, why is this experiment interesting? Because you see how much the issue of inequality and the issue of sustainability are interrelated. So basically, we will have to get to this kind of very ambitious redistribution because, just the ecological catastrophe at some point, where I think we just become so big. I mean, I would like that we do something before they become very big, but, at the very least, I think this will be a driver for change that will be very powerful. And just to conclude with a more positive note, I think it's quite interesting that, countries in the global south, are now some of the first advocates, for global justice, global environmental justice, social justice, fiscal justice, because they are increasingly aware of the fact that they are paying the burden for climate change. They are the first one to lose from there. And they are paying this burden because countries in the north, and particularly the US, but also Europe and Japan and Russia and China, have an accumulated carbon emission in the past 2 centuries that has put the planet into this situation. So, at this stage, we have a storytelling where Trump is telling the rest of the world, we have been badly treated, the US has been exploited by Cambodia, this cannot continue like this. Okay, so that's an interesting piece of TV entertainment, as Trump would say, but at some point we're going to get out of the entertainment and we're going to get real. And I think the alliance of BRIC countries in the global south, will put things on the table. And I think it's very important, for European countries, to understand that, to try to make an alliance with the more democratic side in the global south, Brazil, India, South Africa, rather than, Russia and China, which are not really in the south and which have been some of the worst carbon emitters in recent decades. So I hope, Europe understands this, otherwise, I think things are going to get really bad. The good news, and let me finish this answer with a positive sign, is that, it's interesting that last year, if you think of the G20 global wealth tax discussion, it came from Brazil. Well, it came a little bit from France also, and I'm very happy for that. But, if we forget about the academics who are involved in this discussion, I think in terms of country, it's very interesting that it came from Brazil, who was pushing for this minimum billionaire tax. Some people have been criticizing Brazil by saying, okay, you are not able to push any tax reform in your own parliament, so you're trying to make the show with a global tax. It's not entirely wrong. We have to not to be naive about that. But in any case, the fact that Brazil was so strong to put this on the global agenda is very interesting. When I talk about the global wealth tax 10 years ago in Capital in the 21st century, frankly, I would not have said, okay, Brazil will put that on the agenda. In a way, you would expect European social democratic countries to have the more to lose from tax competition, to be at the initiative. But in fact, it was Brazil. And that's very interesting. Now, European countries, as usual, were very coward. They said, okay, maybe yes, maybe no. They did not dare saying complete no, like the US did. But they didn't dare saying complete yes, because, for all sorts of reasons. So in the end, Brazil was a little bit on its own. India, China were not pushing very strongly. But, I think things could change in the future. India with a different government, instead of having sort of pro-business BJP and a little less pro-business government after the following election, the political balance could change. So I think, the demand coming from the global south for global economic justice, environmental justice will become very strong in the future. It will materialize, or it will help materialize in issues like fiscal justice, minimum billionaire tax. I think it will also have huge consequences, of course, on the reform of the trade system, monetary system, trading without the dollar, and what's happening right now is very likely to accelerate that a lot in the coming months and years.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we have one question there. Sorry. Oh, there.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. Good.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Maya Lucas. Wednesdays, I'm a tax nerd, and the rest of the week I work for the OECD. But so I'm speaking in my capacity as a tax nerd. I wanted just to ask you less of a technical question, but more about, I think this is a pretty unique audience with a lot of knowledge about what we're doing, and I think you're preaching to the choir to some extent. I think it's more important how we convey this message to the middle citizen, and I wanted to get your views on how we can get better at getting buy-in. I think governments, international organizations like mine, I think academia, this is a very interesting forum. How can we be more effective? Because I think tax over the years, and especially I think the past decade, has had very bad press. I think when you talk to the middle citizen, the last thing they want to hear about is tax, either because they hate it or they don't understand it, and they don't understand how important it is in building the societies that we have. So what is your view about this? And also, how can we contribute in our positions, not only to promote this dialogue, but also to hold the people who make decisions accountable for not making the right decisions at the right time? I think we're seeing some claims and some lawsuits from regarding environmental issues. How do you see that moving forward? Thank you.
Well, I think there could be more lawsuit and claims against fiscal inequity. So, when you have top taxpayers who are paying an effective tax rate of 1 or 2% on their income, as opposed to 20, 30, 40% for the middle class or upper middle class, I think there are cases, depending on the country, where there could be, legal action against that. So we need, very broad collective mobilization if we want to be able to address this. Now, as OECD or as academics and but all citizens alike, I think what's important is to stress the inequity, but most importantly to stress, what you will be able to do if you solve this inequity. So I think it's important to stress how you're going to use the money. So here, I was stressing basic inheritance for all. And then, the taxation part, the fact that you're going to have a progressive tax to pay for that, should come after, you stress the sort of the new rights that you're creating. Now, whether this basic inheritance for all is the priority, or whether you should put first more visible money in the education system, the health system, the public infrastructure in transportation, energy, it's a matter for discussion. My own view is that the basic inheritance from all should come sort of last. This is sort of the very important in the long term, in my view, but there are priorities in terms of public services where I think you have to make very visible the fact that this is real money that you can get from billionaire tax. And, we tried last year with Anmol Somanchi, Nitin Bharti, Indian colleagues, and Lucas Chancel, in the Indian election debate, we published a study on rising inequality, billionaire Raj, as we said in India, which had quite a big impact on the Indian political campaign, and the ruling party was very unhappy with this. But it was, the way we would emphasize tax reform priorities in India will be to always compute, how much the health budget and the education budget could increase with such or such tax reform, and express everything in these terms. And I think here, what's very important for all of us is really to stress the fact that there is a lot of money, out there. These are not symbolic measures. And I think that's very important. The billionaire tax proposal, even this 2% on billionaire, in a country like France, we are talking about 20 billion euros. It's a lot of money. I know that some people, I heard that some people find this is too little money to fight for. Well, okay, tell me how you're going to find this money. This is a lot of money if you want to do stuff for hospitals, for doctors. It makes a huge difference. So I think it's important to stress, the numbers. 20 billion is not like 2 billion. It's not, the numbers are really important, and it comes with political mobilization, not to let new exemptions for top wealth owners come back again and again. You need to be very tough on this, very precise about the details. But at the same time, this doesn't have to look too technocratic. So you have to stress that this real money is going to be used to do real stuff. So it's a complex combination. And of course, there are so many people who don't want this to happen and who have a lot of resources that, they are going to spend huge resources to make sure that this does not happen. So it's a complicated fight. But, we have to fight it together. I think, OECD has played a role toward more fiscal coordination. I would say OECD can play an even bigger role, and I think stressing the need for progressive tax at the top. We also have to avoid dead end. So let me, one typical example of dead end in the debate that you hear a lot sometimes by a number of economists is to say, in wealth tax, I'm not sure I like it. What I really like is inheritance tax. Okay, this is completely stupid, because inheritance tax is exactly the tax that people don't want to see. So then, you push for that, and then at the end you say, oh, too bad, people don't like it. This is really very bad, so we don't do anything. So look, there are reasons, good reasons, why people prefer wealth tax than inheritance tax. I mean, I'm not saying of course we should have both. I'm also in favor of inheritance tax, but I think there are really good economic reason why you prefer wealth tax. Economists sometimes don't understand this, but the problem with inheritance tax is that you have an obvious liquidity problem. So, people say, okay, why is it that people don't complain about property tax, which they pay a property tax of 1 or 2% tax each year on their property, and they don't want to pay an inheritance tax of 20%. After all, it's like 20 years of property tax. Yeah, okay, it's like 20 years of property tax, except that if you need to borrow to pay 20 years of property tax right away, it's very complicated. So, sometimes economists live in a sort of bubble where, you have a perfect intertemporal capital markets, everything is equivalent, but no, things are not equivalent. There are good reasons why paying a lot of money directly as inheritance tax can be painful. Now, if you're very rich, it's okay. I mean, but for many people, who have a little wealth, just one home, one little business, this is a problem. And that's why annual wealth tax is much better. We make the case in a paper with Emmanuel Saez on optimal capital taxation and why with imperfect capital markets, you want actually to transfer the optimal inheritance tax into optimal lifetime wealth tax. But, you still have this idea among many economists, let's go for inheritance tax, except that, basic people have a lot more common sense than economists very often, and they don't like it. So this is a typical dead end which, has to go. But unfortunately, the profession is sometimes, has incredible imagination to be conservative, and so it will take time.
Great. I think we have a question there. It has been.
Thank you very much. So I'm Riyad Selmani from the I'm a tax justice advocacy officer for the French NGO CCFD Terre Solidaire. And I was very sensitive to your point on changing the whole economic international architecture and not just tackling the specific question of taxing billionaires, which is, of course, very important. So I wanted to have your take on and your opinion on a process that is going on at the United Nations, which is a UN tax convention process, which you stress the fact that the Global South is today paying the burden of world tax injustice. And at the same time, there is the question of acceptability of tax measures. On the one hand, the Global South has been imposed some tax measures that are ineffective or being asked to accept a framework, for example, the OECD two-pillar solutions framework, that might be also ineffective for them. And so there is now this opportunity to fix the flows of the international tax system, including the question of taxing billionaires, but going way beyond, because it's also tackling it with the question, for example, of transparency, having beneficial ownership registries, but also tackling this question in the question of broader redistribution. So yeah, I wanted, and also tackling other issues such as environmental taxation, multinational companies taxation. So yeah, that's a very ambitious process, and I wanted to have your opinion on this precise process. Thank you.
Sorry, I have a very connected question. I was the next one to ask. Could I just add it up? So you've already touched upon the historical inequality in carbon emission. One could make the argument that the same is true for capital accumulation, international inequalities, slavery, colonialism. As a big fan of redistribution, would you also support international redistribution between high-income countries and low-income countries? And if so, any suggestion on how to achieve that in practice?
Yeah, well, okay. Thank you for these two very simple questions, and very I guess I can answer both in 20 seconds, very easily. No, but to be okay, look, this is going to happen. The good news is that everything you ask for, is going to happen, because, the pressure coming from the Global South in particular is going to become so strong, and, the West is going to become so small, in the coming decades, starting with the US, but also Europe, and also the sum of the two, that, the world is going to be redefined, basically, by a new coalition of countries. And then the only interesting question is to look at what are the ambitious proposals that are going to be made to change, the global tax system, the global trading system, a monetary system, and we want, we want the BRIC in the future, to make the best possible proposal. We want Europe to discuss with Brazil, with South Africa, with India. We want, this is a discussion we need to have. So we are not going to solve them all right now, but we can start to take them one by one, very quickly. When we talk about billionaire taxation, I think it's very important that at least a share, and in my view, a substantial share of the tax revenue go to each country in the world, in proportion to their population or in proportion to their exposure to climate change or a combination of the two, and not just depending on where are the billionaires located or where are their businesses located. Because if you look, in a broad perspective, well, first, who bears the consequences of climate change? These are typically countries, say in sub-Saharan Africa, who don't get any investment from anyone today, but who are bearing the consequences. If you take a very long-run perspective, the Industrial Revolution and economic development was, of course, the product of a, world division of labor, world exploitation of natural resources and human labor, sometimes in a very brutal manner, as you know. So we are not here to make necessarily all the different account for the exact amount of reparation, but we have to take this into account. And I've written about specific cases like the reparation to Haiti, which are so caricatural that I think a direct reparation will make sense. But more generally, it's better just to look at the future and to ensure that we have a global tax and economic system so that every country has the financial resources to develop and invest in infrastructure on their own. And so redistributing tax revenue, typically billionaire tax, at least a fraction of it to each country, including Mali, Bangladesh, in proportion to their population, for these countries, public finances will make a huge difference. And the people who say they don't know how to use the money, are not serious people. If you look right now at the amount of resources you have in the budget of Mali or Bangladesh per children, in the education budget, they have like 5-10 euros per children. The productivity that they manage to get, the health outcome and education and literacy outcomes that they manage to get with 5 euros per student, as compared to what we get with 5,000, is just heroic. This is the best return on the planet. Best return by far on the planet if you divide by the money amount that's invested. So people who say they don't know how to use the money are just stupid neocolonialists. This has always been the story under colonialism. These people don't know how to rule themselves. We have to rule them. This is the same story today based on zero evidence. If you look at the money amount, this is the best used money in the planet is in the education ministry of Mali and Bangladesh. So, we have to check, sometimes, there can be exceptions, countries that are in a war, you need to check, try to help solve the war rather than sell guns. So you have to look carefully at each situation. But by and large, this money will be incredibly well used if it was redistributed, just a fraction of this tax revenue. Now, taxation is one example. We mentioned the trade system. Look, I think the market exchange rate at which we trade commodities right now for sub-Saharan African countries or many countries in Latin America or South Asia are just unfair, in the sense that if we were trading at a parity that was closer to PPP, they will get a lot more resources for the commodities they export and for the goods they export. They could use the money to invest. So here, it's again an issue of reparation. It's not an issue of being generous, giving money. No, it's just reparation for money that has been unduly extracted from these countries. Because there's no reason why you should trade with this speculative market exchange rate rather than with PPP currency. And there's someone called Keynes who in 1943 proposed an international clearing union where you will trade at parities closer to purchasing power parity rather than market exchange rate with a centralized system of credits and debits so that you get comparable rate of return to borrow and on your foreign assets, which in itself could completely change the face of what each country is getting from trade. So, okay, this is very, very different from what Trump is asking today, which is basically telling Cambodia stop exploiting the US. But, at some point, I want to be optimistic that, a coalition of, reasonable people, poor and rich from the south, from the north, will bring a different platform for change. And I think this kind of meetings that we're having, can contribute in its own little way to try to build this kind of platform. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. And speaking of building international platforms, I think we have a question from Guillermo Melo from the Ministry of Finance.
Hello. My name is Guilherme Melo. I'm from Ministry of Finance in Brazil. And when I saw your proposal, I mean, I'm very keen to the idea and to the concept, because we were discussing in the previous session that the taxation on billionaires, especially the 2% taxation, is a very important first step, but is not enough to change the path of more inequality in wealth and income. But one of the things we discussed is whether to construct the political environment to approve and apply these reforms in international and national ways. I mean, do you believe that the proposal you present here, it's more likely to have success being applied nationally by a coalition of the willings, or in an international agreement like Pillar 2, which is not all international because we know the United States won't come in. But why I'm asking this, because in Brazil, we just sent a proposal of reform on income, which is based on a minimum taxation of effective taxation of 10% on millionaires, and is getting a very good repercussion in the population. It's very well approved. Actually, we combined with exemption of payment of income taxes for people who earn like $800, something close to this in Brazilian reals. But the approval for the taxation of the rich is bigger than the approval for the exemption on the middle classes. So yeah, we managed to get a proposal, a very simple proposal, to get a lot of support. But we know that if we aimed higher, that we should, of course, the resistance would be a lot larger in a domestic way. But if we had a coalition of the willing, or at this best scenario, an international agreement, it would be a lot easier to implement domestically a more bold reform. The same thing goes to Pillar 2, because we approved and implemented Pillar 2, but that was only possible because it was international agreement. So I would like you to comment on this. Thank you very much.
So, I think what history suggests, and the history of progressive taxation in the 20th century suggests, is that you have, waves of reform. So, once you have a couple of countries who adopt a certain kind of reform, and in particular, if it's a couple of powerful countries, but, the map of powerful countries in the 21st and 20th century is not going to be exactly the same one. But in the 20th century, as soon as US, Britain, Germany, France, Sweden adopted very progressive taxation between 1910, 1930, 1940. It became sort of the new standard, and everybody, even Spain under Franco, had a very progressive tax. It's not that Franco was a big fan of progressive taxation. It's just that everybody was doing it at the time. So it became like, you do it. It's so. I think here it is the same issue. So we cannot wait for G20 to all agree. I think we need individual countries to act as soon as they can. That's for sure. But at the same time, it's very important to have this forum where countries discuss, make plans together, even if they are not implemented together right away. Because what we know is that as soon as it becomes concrete for a handful of countries, then the balance can change. And I was referring earlier to what happened in 2020 with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. Today this can seem like ancient history, but I think it's important to remember that at the time, Biden won the nomination in the end, but together Warren and Sanders were almost 50-50 with Biden, and we're not talking of a remote extreme left-wing party, somewhere in wherever. It was the Democratic nomination for the United States presidency, so it was almost 50-50. And actually, in the young voters, and when I say young voters, it's actually below 50, so almost myself. Sanders and Warren had a huge majority of the vote. So, they could have not been nominated. Maybe the problem is that they were divided. Maybe some more younger candidate. Maybe a bit less white. Whatever. You could have a different kind of profile would have worked better. But in any case, it was close. And then, what I mean is that if the US had adopted this, it could have change enormously the political landscape very easily. To conclude, it will be much easier for Brazil or for India or for South Africa to have a progressive wealth tax and progressive reform today if that was to happen. And I think, we were close. So sometimes you have lost opportunities like 2020, but, these lost opportunities will they will come back and they will maybe not be lost anymore. So these things, it's very important to prepare ourselves for, unexpected bifurcation and unexpected changes, and people who say today, okay, nothing is going to happen, this is too complicated, the coalition of the wealthy is too powerful. They don't know about history. If you look at the past history of the 20th century, or let alone world history since the French Revolution, you always have people who say the wealthy are too powerful, nothing will happen, and then things happen, and the world has changed in incredible manner. The richest countries in the world today, they put almost half of their national income in a collective way to pay for public health, education, etc. And before World War I, it was less than 10%. And if you had told the elite before World War I it would go from 10 to 50, they would have said, okay, this is communism, the world is going to be destroyed, the economy is going to collapse, the sky is going to fall. Except that things went very well, and if anything, we had the biggest productivity growth ever, and things are going to continue this way because that's a sense of history, and this is also the only solution to face the challenges we have ahead. So very important that each country do what they can and have at the same time the global coalition in mind. What I understand from what you said is that in Brazil, so now you're proposing a 10% minimum tax rate on income for billionaires, so not just 2% for millionaires, and that it's actually it's very popular, at least as much as the 2% proposal last year. It's more visible, maybe in a way.
The exemption. It's more popular in Brazil
exemption for middle class
than the exemption that were given to the middle class. We're combining a taxation of the millionaires with exemption for the middle class. There are a lot of support for exemption on middle class, but there are more support
for the top
on taxation of the top because it's a sense of justice. Everyone agrees.
And I think, sometimes higher tax rate can be easier to understand because sometimes, 2% tax rate, people can feel, okay, this is very small, this is what we had in the past. In fact, it makes a big difference if it's a comprehensive tax base, of course, and that's the whole point. But, sometimes having bigger tax rate can also be a way to have more political mobilization. I mean, that being said, I'm not saying at all that the G20 proposal last year should have been this table over there that I was proposing. I think there are different roles to play here. There are different discourses to have. I think it's... Yes, so you see, Gabriel, that would have been a nice report. But I'm not saying this at all. I think really, there are different roles to play. I think it's important to go for reasonable first steps. And at the same time, it's important to talk about the long run. This is about the long run. I am very clear on this. I'm not saying, if I was candidate for election, I will never be candidate for any election. But if I were, I would never propose this. That would be ridiculous. But I think at the same time, there's a role, for intellectuals and civic society to talk about just beyond next election and to talk about the long run. But to me, this is a kind of objective that is more over the course of the 21st century. Like, the construction of the welfare state, it took a century to go from 10% of national income to 50%. This is a kind of transformation. What do we want in the next century or in the next 50 years? And I think the two exercises, talking about next year and next 50 years, we need to have the two discussions, including in that kind of conference today.
Amazing. Okay, great. Thank you. I think we ran out of time, unfortunately, for extra questions. But I want to thank you, Thomas, a lot for the very thought-provoking and forward-looking conversation on how we can build not only a more fair tax system, but also a more fair and equal society and more sustainable world.